Africa has a long and complex history of exploitation by European colonial powers. For centuries, Africa's vast natural resources and labor force were extracted for the benefit of European economic development. This pattern continued into the 20th century as Europe maintained political and economic control over most of Africa. However, a revolution is now happening. African nations are asserting their independence, removing the vestiges of colonial rule, and claiming their rightful place on the global stage. The age of unlimited European exploitation of Africa appears to be ending. As a result, Europe now finds itself in an uncertain position, anxious to maintain partnerships in Africa, but no longer able to dictate terms. In a recent speech, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen exhibited this anxiety. She appealed to African leaders for continued cooperation, but maintained a paternalistic, quasi-colonial tone. Her words provide keen insight into Europe's perspective on its relationship with Africa. Let's analyze her message and what it reveals.
We're not only interested in extracting resources. We want to partner with you to create local value chains, to create good jobs here in Africa.
For centuries, Europe extracted Africa's human and natural resources for its own enrichment. The transatlantic slave trade from the 16th to 19th centuries ripped away millions of Africans to serve as slave labor in the Americas. This mass enslavement depleted Africa's workforce and undermined economic development. At the same time, the slave trade provided essential labor for European capitalist ventures. It stimulated growth in mining, agriculture, and manufacturing. Profits from the slave trade fueled further capitalist investments and inventions. When the slave trade declined in the 19th century, Europe shifted to direct colonial rule in Africa. From the 1870s to 1900, European powers colonized almost the entire African continent. Colonialism imposed European political and economic control through military force and deception. Under colonialism, Africa became a source of raw materials for European industry. African laborers worked European-owned mines and plantations. Colonial policy discouraged local manufacturing and industrialization in Africa to prevent competition with Europe. Infrastructure projects were designed only to extract resources more efficiently. European colonial powers reoriented African economies toward exporting raw materials and importing European manufactured goods. Traditional local trading systems were destroyed. Colonial currency systems facilitated the extraction of African capital to Europe. The result was systematic underdevelopment of African economies. Hunger and famine became widespread as people were pushed off their land and food production declined. Europe enriched itself by deliberately stifling Africa's independent development. In the post-WW2 era, overt European political control in Africa gradually receded. However, the economic exploitation continued under new guises. Through global institutions like the IMF and World Bank, Europe imposed damaging neoliberal economic policies on African nations. Structural adjustment programs forced African countries to slash public spending, privatize industries, and remove protections for local producers. This re-entrenched Africa's position as an exporter of raw materials and importer of manufactured goods. Local industries could not compete with multinational corporations. Cuts to health and education programs created lasting social impacts. In many countries, economic performance fell even below 1960s levels. Europe continued extracting value from Africa through unfair trade deals, biased investment policies, and the enduring colonial banking system. Independence brought political but not economic emancipation. The fundamentals of resource exploitation remained intact. Today, the tide is turning. A new generation of assertive, visionary leaders is emerging in Africa. They are diversifying their partnerships beyond Europe, especially with China. They are industrializing, climbing value chains, and leveraging their resource wealth. Above all, they are beginning to reject the enduring colonial narratives and institutions that have constrained Africa's development. This threatens to entirely upend Europe's position. Suddenly, Europe finds itself losing access to Africa's resources and markets. After centuries of exploitation, Europe has become dependent on Africa. Without its former African colonies, Europe's economy would face severe challenges. Europe fears irrelevance and seeks to re-entrench ties. This explains the anxious tone behind von der Leyen's speech. She says Europe does not merely want to extract resources from Africa. Rather, it wants to help build local industry, train workers, establish supply chains, and more. But this patently ignores history and retains a neo-colonial posture. Europe cannot expect to shed its legacy of exploitation so easily. Its intentions remain transparent, to maintain political influence and economic benefits in Africa. Von der Leyen claims Europe and Africa can achieve a win-win relationship by strengthening economic ties. But this win-win notion rests on flawed assumptions of equality between Europe and Africa. In reality, reduced European access to Africa's resources poses no existential threat to Africa. Europe, on the other hand, relies profoundly on African trade and materials. By insisting on preserving its advantages, Europe reveals its true perceptions. Africa deserves genuine, equitable partnerships that support its independent development. But first, the legacy of European exploitation must be acknowledged and dismantled. Reparations may be necessary. Europe must relinquish its sense of entitlement and paternalism toward Africa. If Europe cannot adapt to Africa's new assertiveness, it risks irrelevance on the global stage. Africa's future will be defined on its own terms, not those of former colonial masters. This new era promises prosperity and sovereignty if Africa charts its course wisely. Deep ties with Europe may play a role, but only as one partner among many, not the dominating force. Africa possesses tremendous power. It is the last region of the world to be truly decolonized. Its leaders should recognize the prevailing dynamics and leverage them astutely. The age of European dictates is over if Africa chooses to make it so. This is Africa's opportunity to achieve economic and political independence, reverse centuries of harm, and take its rightful place as a global leader.